Veteran broadcaster Andrew Neil has covered 13 general elections beginning back in 1974 in February. He has interviewed 7 prime ministers, although notoriously, famously, Boris Johnson refused to sit down and be interviewed by him when he was running in 2019. In fact, what you did was you delivered the interview you would have done with Boris Johnson to the viewers of your programme.
Which said that the issues I wished to raise overwhelmingly were issues of trust. Can we trust you, Mr. Johnson? Well, that was a good question, wasn't it?
Wasn't it just? Today you launch your brand new Times radio show. It's analysing the election. Also, you're a colleague, would you say good friend of Dianne Abbott?
Yeah, you see Dianne a lot every week.
And how do you feel she's been treated by the Labour Party, and how big an issue is her treatment?
Shabbily, I think she's been treated, and unnecessarily so. You know, I can understand why the Labour leadership would think it's time for Dianne to step down. She's not been very well recently either. It'd be quite humane to say, let's get you out of here now. But you need to do that in a way that is a gentle and compassionate move on. And look after her and have it agreed, whereas instead they seem to have been all over the place. I mean, it's become an issue in which I think, will her future eventually be decided in Starmer's first term, or will it take 2 terms to decide Miss Abbott's future?
What she wrote
a year ago, and on.
What she wrote a year ago was wrong, but she then apologised, and there was an investigation. And once you've gone through that process and she's apologised, the right thing to do is to restore the whip, which they did very belatedly after months of dithering, and then they briefed to the Times newspaper, which is, of course, now close to your heart, off to Times Radio, that she's going to not be allowed to stand, even though she was back with the Labour whip. It made no sense.
And then they changed their mind again. You know, to say, well, you can stand. So I think it's unfortunate. It's not a... Look, I've known Dianne a long while. She does have some loopy ideas. She once tried to argue with me on air, so there's a clip, that the fact that 47 million people died under Chairman Mao wasn't really such a bad thing because he built the country. So that, but even so, I think, if you know, she has her place in the history books.
Yeah.
She's the first ever black female MP. That matters. And she's been a member of Parliament for a long, long time. And so any political party that values its traditions and its people that have made it should have thought of a better way of getting her to stand down, mutually agreed, to everybody's satisfaction, no rancour.
Tomorrow night, Julie Etchingham hosts the first of the leaders' debates.
And she's very good at these things.
She's excellent. If you had been called upon to do the same thing instead of Julie, what do you think are going to be the prickly issues?
I think the 2 fundamental issues, one for Mr. Sunak, who's proposing new policies. I think the question for him is, look, if this is such a good idea, you've had 14 years to do it. Why didn't you do it in 14 years? And I think and that's a tough one to answer, I think. I think for Mr. Starmer it is, well, you say that, but you've said the following things over the past 5 years, none of which you now stand for. I mean, I interviewed him for the Labour leadership on the BBC. I think it was towards the end of February 2020, just before the pandemic started to hit. And he went through a whole range of things, nationalised rail, mail, energy, and so on, abolish universal credit, abolish university tuition fees, wealth tax, and all the rest of it. And I said, but how can we... He said, Andrew, these are not promises, these are pledges. Now, I didn't, just being a simple lad, didn't understand the difference between promise and pledge. I thought they're the same thing, but it doesn't matter what it means because he's broken them all. So I think that's a problem for him.
Can I ask you about your comments about the 2 leaders? We were just saying before we went on air, your first election campaign was 1974 as a journalist. I was 7 years old. I remember that election campaign. Back in 97, when Tony Blair and Gordon Brown were arriving, people said, I know, but they're not the same as the great generation of Dennis Healey or Clement Attlee or Jim Callaghan. And the same thing they would have said about David Cameron, George Osborne. These aren't Harold Macmillan or Rab Butler. When you say that Rishi Sunak and Keir Starmer are second-grade politicians, is that just because we're getting older, or is it true?
Well, obviously, clearly, I didn't mean to say second rate. And are you sure I said it?
Second grade.
Because what I meant to say was third rate.
OK.
So I thought we'd just get that on the record.
Good.
I mean, I think it's not just the two leaders. The cabinet and the shadow cabinet are pretty second rate as well. Both are. There's a few exceptions, but by and large, they're not up to the task. And I find that we live in a strange age of politicians in which we've got these pretty low-grade politicians on both sides of the House, and yet we expect more and more of them. I mean, they can't even do what they're meant to do, and yet we still ask them to do more and more. If they would concentrate on doing what only governments can do, defence of the realm, keep the country safe, the welfare of the people, the condition of the people, as it used to be called in the 19th century, and everything else should be slightly sidelined until they've mastered that. I mean, one of the things about this campaign that struck me is that they are turning small differences that you could barely get a playing card between the two parties, defence being a perfect example of it, into massive kind of ideological disputes. And they're not. And it cheats the people. Take Labour's defence policy announcement this morning on the nuclear deterrent. That's exactly the same as the government policy. There's no difference. Is there a difference?
Except there's a massive difference with what the previous Labour leader's
That goes back to my previous points about Mr Starmer.
And where would you put Jeremy Corbyn in your hierarchy? First grade, second grade, third grade?
I think for the sake of diplomacy, I'll pass on that.
Who do you rate?
His lawyers may be watching.
Who do you rate as our last quality political figure Prime Minister?
Oh, I think it's hard to take that away from Tony Blair. And more people would appreciate that if it hadn't been for Iraq. I mean, one of the tragedies of the Blair years, which were pretty successful domestically, and by the way, Labour did not cause the crash of 2008. That was a banking international crash. And actually, they handled it rather well, the outcome. There was limited they could do, and they did it rather well. But Iraq has overshadowed the Blair years. And of course, for some people, they'll never forgive him for that. I mean, I feel angry about it. But it means that Mr Blair can't even walk down the high street these days. I met him recently, not recently, a couple of years ago, in his office. I'll just say up by the BBC. I won't go further than that. I said, Mick, why don't we just pop out for a coffee? He said, I can't go, Andrew. Can't go out. Can't walk down the high street. Sad.
Can the TV debates change the weather? All the evidence is they don't change anything. What do you think?
I don't think they can. I mean, normally campaigns don't change that much. There are exceptions. Theresa May's campaign, she started 20 points ahead.
She did an interview with you.
Yeah.
Which I think, if I remember, was not a great interview.
It was not a great interview. It was sadly overshadowed because it was also the night of the Manchester bomb.
Of course it was.
So it was overshadowed. So I don't think the debates can change much. I mean, we're in a situation, I think, where it doesn't matter what the Tories say, they're going to lose. And Labour's thought, let's not say anything because we're going to win. Let's just not say anything and we'll get elected. It's very different from 97, when the people were certainly, to use a very good Scottish word, scunnered by the Tories, as they are again. But unlike in 97, people are not gagging for Keir Starmer. They actually liked the cut of Tony Blair's jib in 97. That's why the majority was so huge.
If you want to hear more from the voice of experience, Andrew Neil, you can hear him starting today, 1 o'clock, Times Radio.
I have to say, I'm unusual at this. I personally, in my old days, I always loved being interviewed by you. I really enjoed it.
Well, I always enjoyed it.
You're forensic and tough, and that's great.
But you also had that unusual feature of knowing what you were talking about.
And thank goodness for that.